A single voice vote in Congress in 1986, barely noticed at the time, permanently froze the entire legal supply of civilian machine guns in America. No new registrations since, none ever again. Machine guns are just one of 7 weapon categories, locked behind federal laws most Americans have never encountered. Laws covering grenades, nerve agents, even anthrax. This countdown starts where the legal line first blurs, the ammunition itself. Number 7. Explosive military ordnance draws a sharp legal boundary most Americans never notice. Under federal law, it's not just the launcher that matters. Battlefield-grade ammunition itself can be regulated as a weapon of war. The key line is a 1/4 ounce of explosive charge. Any missile, shell, or similar device exceeding that threshold becomes a destructive device under the National Firearms Act. Take the 20mm high explosive shell, a round that looks like oversized ammunition, but, by law, triggers the same controls as a tank-busting rocket. Civilian ownership requires registration, a fingerprint-based background check, and a $200 tax stamp for each individual round, if registration is even possible. Once the device is detonated, the tax stamp is destroyed, closing the legal loop. This framework, rooted in organized crime-era legislation, quietly extends federal reach into the realm of military ordnance, making even a single high-explosive projectile a matter of national concern. The result? Battlefield ammunition, not just the weapon, is locked down by a hidden architecture of regulation. Number 6. The federal government draws a hard line around certain biological agents, treating them as threats on par with weapons of war. The Federal Select Agent Program, managed jointly by the CDC and USDA, governs a list of bacteria, viruses, and toxins that could cause mass casualties if released. Possession, use, or transfer of these select agents, anthrax among them, requires registration as a secure laboratory, not just a firearms license. Tier 1 agents like Bacillus anthracis sit at the very top of the risk scale, triggering the strictest controls. Background checks for all personnel, detailed security plans, and annual facility inspections. For civilians, legal access is completely out of reach. Federal law makes it a felony to possess or transfer these agents outside of registered labs. This isn't about firepower or explosive charge, but about the invisible risk of biological catastrophe, a threat so severe that even academic researchers must clear a maze of federal hurdles before handling a single vial. Number 5. Federal law draws an unmistakable red line around chemical weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention Implementation Act of 1998 transformed an international agreement into direct, enforceable U.S. law. Under this statute, it is a federal crime to knowingly develop, acquire, stockpile, or possess a chemical weapon. No exceptions for collectors, researchers, or private citizens. The law's reach is not about household bleach or industrial cleaners, but about chemicals weaponized for harm, nerve agents, choking agents, or toxic compounds prepared for use as weapons. This prohibition stands apart from other regulated weapons, imposing a total ban rather than a licensing or registration system. The Supreme Court tested the boundaries of this law in Bond versus United States, where a private citizen's use of toxic chemicals in a personal dispute raised the question of federal overreach. The court ultimately limited the statute's application to true weapons, reinforcing that the ban targets acts consistent with the intent of the international treaty. For most Americans, this is a law they will never directly encounter, but its presence quietly shapes the boundaries of civilian access, making chemical weapons strictly off-limits by design. Number 4. Anti-tank rocket launchers occupy a strange space in American weapons law. On paper, federal regulations offer a path for civilian ownership. Registration under the National Firearms Act, a $200 tax stamp, and a fingerprint-based background check. But the reality is more complex. Modern anti-tank weapons like the AT-4 are classified as destructive devices, grouped with bombs, missiles, and landmines. The law sets a clear threshold. Any launcher with more than 4 ounces of propellant falls under this strict regime. Yet even if a civilian wanted to follow every legal step, there is no way to buy a working AT-4. The Swedish manufacturer, Saab, sells exclusively to military clients and has never offered functional launchers to the public. Only inert trainer models, incapable of firing live rockets, have surfaced in police buyback programs. The result is a legal contradiction. The rules allow for ownership in theory, but the total absence of a civilian supply chain makes these weapons functionally unavailable. It is a sharp reminder that the law's technical pathways mean little when the marketplace is closed by design. Number 3. Grenades and landmines represent the most granular level of federal weapons control, where each live explosive becomes its own legal event. The Gun Control Act of 1968 drew a new line by reclassifying grenades, landmines, and bombs as destructive devices, shifting the focus from broad categories to the individual object. Civilian ownership is technically possible, but every grenade or mine demands a separate fingerprint-based background check, a $200 tax stamp, and full federal registration. The process does not grant a blanket permit. Each device is registered individually. Once a grenade is detonated, its registration and tax stamp are destroyed with it, erasing any proof of lawful possession for that device. Anyone seeking another must start the entire process from scratch. New background check, new paperwork, new tax stamp. This creates a legal maze so complex that, while ownership is not outright banned, the burden of compliance makes it nearly unattainable. For the handful of collectors who navigate this system, each live explosive is less a weapon and more a bureaucratic anomaly, caught between theory and practical impossibility. Number 2. Federal law draws one of its clearest lines in the sand at large-bore anti-material weapons. The statute is blunt. Any firearm with a bore diameter greater than half an inch, 12.7 millimeters, falls under the definition of a destructive device. This is not about how much explosive it fires, but the geometry of the barrel itself. Most shotguns and certain rifles escape this designation because they qualify for a sporting exemption, a carve-out written directly into the law. That exception, however, is narrowly defined and tightly controlled by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. The paradox emerges with muzzle-loading cannons, which can be legal to own as antiques if they fire only non-explosive projectiles. But the moment an owner wants to fire an explosive shell, each round must be registered individually as a destructive device, with a separate tax stamp and background check. Artillery pieces and large anti-material rifles are thus placed in the same legal neighborhood as bombs and rockets, not because of what they do, but because of the barrel's dimensions. This is one of the most straightforward statutory boundaries separating civilian firearms from true weapons of war. And finally, in first place, post-1986 machine guns stand as the clearest example of how a single legislative maneuver can reshape an entire market permanently. The Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986 was intended as a broad reform, easing some restrictions for gun owners. But in the closing hours of debate, Representative William Hughes introduced a last-minute amendment that would freeze the civilian machine gun registry. The amendment passed on an unrecorded voice vote, sidestepping the usual roll call and leaving no clear record of individual support or dissent. From that moment, federal law barred the manufacture and registration of any new machine gun for civilian ownership after May 19, 1986. The effect was immediate and irreversible. The supply of transferable machine guns became a closed pool. Whatever existed on the registry that day was all that would ever be available to private individuals, with no possibility of expansion. Every time a registered machine gun is destroyed, seized, or lost, the civilian pool shrinks further, never to be replenished. This artificial scarcity has driven prices to astonishing heights. In the mid-1990s, a transferable M16 lower receiver might have sold for around $7,000. By 2024, the same part routinely commands $35,000 to $45,000, while rare models like the FG42 or MG42 have reached $400,000 or more at auction. Even entry-level automatics that sold for a few $100s in the early 1980s now fetch $8,000 to $12,000. The ATF continues to process transfers for this dwindling pool, but every transaction is burdened by months of paperwork, background checks, and a $200 tax stamp that has not changed since 1934. For most Americans, the reality of the machine gun freeze remains hidden in plain sight, a legal boundary created by an overlooked voice vote, with market consequences that ripple to this day. The Hughes Amendment didn't just change the law. It created a permanent, shrinking island of civilian machine gun ownership, where each weapon is both a collector's item and a relic of legislative history. Across all 7 entries, one pattern stands out. Federal law draws a hard line where weapons transform from personal arms into instruments of mass destruction. These boundaries aren't about technology. They're about the government's calculation of public risk. Which weapon surprised you most? Subscribe for more investigations.